This lecture introduces you to primary source research. This is important information for both doing primary source word studies as well as historical cultural context research as you interpret the New Testament. And one interesting thing about this particular slide is that this lovely picture of St. Paul writing his epistles is actually wrong. Primary source research would have led one to work with scrolls and sheets of papyrus or parchment, and the book had not yet been invented, as far as we know, in the first century. What do we mean by primary and secondary sources? So in New Testament studies, a primary source is the New Testament itself. But also we can talk about primary sources in terms of other literature that helps us understand the context of our primary source that we're studying. And so primary sources are sources produced during the time of study. If we're looking at the New Testament, that would be then other sources from the time that shed light on what the text of the New Testament is saying. We would be looking at Jewish literature. We'd be looking at Greek and Roman literature as well as early Christian literature, and say that this is these are primary sources. Now, early Christian literature can also be commentary on the text of the New Testament, and so in that sense, they are the earliest secondary sources. Secondary sources are the sources that interpret and analyze the primary sources. So certainly any contemporary literature interpreting the text of the New Testament would be considered a secondary source. But also anything since the time of the Church Fathers doing the same thing also would be in that category. Now, just by one further example, if one were studying John Calvin, then Calvin's writings would be primary sources. Writings at the time of Calvin that shed light on Calvin's writings would be primary sources. But any sources using Calvin's writings would be secondary sources. And so that is an important distinction for us to make. One of the things about learning how to interpret the New Testament is that you need to learn how to work with primary sources. One of the things we want to accomplish in our curriculum of education is to help the student get beyond the secondary sources, to dig deeper, and to work with actual primary texts. And that applies specifically to doing word studies as well as to reading literature in its context using ancient sources. And for the New Testament, as I said, that would be Jewish sources, that would be the Greek and Roman literature, and we could include the literature that overlaps between primary and secondary sources in the early church to help us get into that context of the first century as best we can. Now, one of the things that we have to do is learn how to access the primary sources. So we know how to get a hold of the primary source in terms of the New Testament, and we know that we need to read it in the original language to work with the primary source as closely as we can. But we also have to learn how to get at the other primary sources. And that's part of what this lecture is going to do. One thing to note about secondary sources is that there are tools for studying a text like the New Testament, as well as commentaries and journal articles about the text. And so one thing to realize is that these tools are actually secondary sources themselves, and they need, therefore, to be used critically. They could be wrong. So they are the work that scholars have done on the primary sources, but you need to be able to critique that work or agree with it and be able to do the work yourself. And for example, then, a tool would be a lexicon, a dictionary. Just because a dictionary says a word means something, though, does not necessarily mean that they've quite captured the meaning of that word, or that it really applies that way in the passage you're looking at. Grammars, concordances, translations, as well as things like theological word dictionaries and dictionaries and encyclopedias and atlases. All of this is scholarly work that helps us read primary sources, but they are themselves secondary sources to be used critically, just like a commentary or a journal article or a book. Now, in the following lectures, we're going to be looking at sources for words and grammar and syntax. We'll be looking at tools to use toward that end. We'll be talking about the methodology to use for word studies and grammatical studies and syntactical studies. We'll also be looking at sources for historical and cultural context research. And again, there are certain tools that we can use, and we have to figure out how to access as well as search in those tools. And then also, again, we talk about methodology for primary source research in the historical and cultural context. What is the proper use of primary sources? And then thirdly, we will be talking about sources for intertextuality. By intertextuality, you might think very simply in New Testament studies of the New Testament use of the Old Testament. There is an intertextual relationship because the New Testament authors know the Old Testament and are using it, alluding to it, quoting it, echoing it. And what tools do we have for this research in intertextuality in New Testament studies, and what should our methodology be? Let's take an example as we undergo this research. 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 10 form a sin list in Paul's writing to the Corinthian church. Paul says, "Or do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be misled, neither the sexually immoral, pornoi, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, moikoi, nor malakoi, nor arsenokoitai." What are these two words? What does this mean? Malakos is its general use. It simply means soft. But who are soft men? Malakoi. And what is arsenokoitai? What does that mean? Arsen can mean male, and koitos means bed. And so here are some translations of these two terms. The NAS translates it as nor effeminate nor homosexuals. So soft is taken as effeminate, and men bedders is taken as homosexual. The King James Version translates these words as effeminate and abusers of themselves with mankind, which seems to be a roundabout way of saying homosexual. The English Standard Version takes the two words together and translates them as men who practice homosexuality. So the two words are both understood as homosexuals. And sometimes it's been suggested that the malakos is the passive male homosexual and the arsenokoites is the active homosexual in an active-passive relationship. And then 1 Corinthians 6:9 in the NRSV translates these words as male prostitutes, so it limits the malakos to homosexuals who are doing prostitution, and then it translates the second word as sodomite, which is an Old English word for. Now, I want to mention two scholars at the beginning here and their interpretations of this, and then right at the end we'll come back to this. Arland Holtgren, a Lutheran from the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, which is a liberal mainline denomination, argued that 1 Corinthians 6:9's malakoi probably refers to the young male who had not yet grown a beard or other bodily hair. In other words, he was soft. And in that sense, the direction of his interpretation is to talk about a pederastic relationship, that is, an adult male having sex with a younger boy or a young teenage boy. And then Holtgren says that arsenokoitai should be taken with malakoi to mean the adult male, the pederast himself. Thus, the two terms refer to the practice of pederasty, not homosexuality in general. The passage has often been taken in the history of Christian interpretation, as well as by many today, to be a word against homosexual practices in general. But here, an interpretation like that of Holtgren is limiting that to what we might today call pedophilia or pederasty. Victor Paul Furnish, fairly well known in Methodist circles as well as generally in New Testament scholarship, as Holtgren is, Furnish surmised that arsenokoitai in 1 Corinthians 6:9 had to do with the customers of call boys. And so this would be adult males going to homosexual prostitutes, and perhaps the emphasis being on young men receiving or engaged in sexual favors with these adult males. These kinds of interpretations have a limiting effect on the meaning of 1 Corinthians 6:9 and make it difficult to apply Paul's words generally to homosexuality. I'm going to be arguing against that position, but the arguments are going to be based in a more thorough study of primary sources. The other person I wanted to mention here is John Boswell. Boswell is very well known in circles around the interpretation of texts from antiquity about homosexuality, including the biblical passages. Boswell was a classic scholar who was himself a homosexual, and he early came out writing against interpretation of texts in antiquity, that is against the idea that texts in antiquity were referring to homosexuality as we know it today. And there are lots of dimensions to this argument. But regarding the word malakos, he says that the term should not be translated in reference to homosexuality. Rather, he says that the term has to do with, it can be used these ways: unruffled by others' anger, sort of being soft in an argument situation. Secondly, it might mean effeminate in a writing. This is a cultural assessment of behavior, and I would say, so for example, something like being limp-wristed, not necessarily homosexual. Or third, he says it was used in reference to masturbation and moral laxity, and at this point he gives absolutely no references for his argument. It seems to be pure conjecture. Then fourthly, Greek words for effeminacy included, and then he lists several, and it is true that these apply, but these two words are presented as if the word malakos does not mean effeminate, And I will argue that that's not true. So theludrios and androgynos are words for effeminate. In the word androgynos, you can see a combined word of male, woman, male, female. And so that word is fairly obviously pointing to something like this. A womanly man, we might say. And yet, while sounding terribly scholarly with his references to primary sources, he actually has failed to do the work he needs to do, and he excludes malakos as another synonym. Fifthly, if the term was used of homosexuals, it was not being used to designate them as such, but just as a general derogatory term that was also used of others. We might throw out a term like queer, and while it has a more general meaning, we can apply it specifically to a homosexual. That might be a parallel here. And then sixth, he says it is not a term for passive partners in male homosexual relationships. Other terms are used. So what other terms are used for an active-passive relationship in homosexuality? Drontes and paskontes, or paiderastai and paidika, the active and passive pederast. Now that's John Boswell's argument way back in 1980 that was highly influential in mainline denominations in their changing the policies and practices and beliefs about the ethics of homosexuality. Back in 1980, here we have it. He's not the first to have argued along these lines, but he is one of the major players. So how to get started in primary source research? You'll need to look things up in lexicons and theological word dictionaries. You'll need to do word searches on electronic databases for primary sources. You need to look up words and topics in concordances and indices to primary source texts and translations. You'll need to look up the primary sources that these works reference and check them for yourself to see that they are clearly on the subject. And you need to check other scholarship on the word or topic to see if your interpretation really does hold up. So you want to check secondary sources then in this last step, concordances, journal articles, monographs, commentaries. Now here we have malakos in the Low-Nida lexicon. And we can also be looking at a variety of lexicons, not just one. It's important to check the work in as many lexicons as are worth checking, and not just in one single dictionary. And in Low-Nida, the approach is to look at a word with respect to other synonyms and antonyms to locate its range of meaning. And Low-Nida is a unique lexicon in this way, and I would just say always check it. Low-Nida is available on some of the electronic programs for Bible study, like BibleWorks. So with that said, we could say that malakos in Low-Nida is understood as the passive male partner in homosexual intercourse. And so it suggests the translation as homosexual, but with that emphasis. And then they say for a context of malakos, see 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 10, and then it gives a reference to a passage within the lexicon itself, 88.280. As in Greek, a number of other languages also have entirely distinct terms for the active and passive roles in homosexual intercourse, they say. And already we have then a disagreement with Boswell in Louw-Nida. And then also Louw-Nida say that arsenokoites is a male partner in homosexual intercourse, also translate the word as homosexual. That then leads you to a translation like the ESV, which takes the two words together and simply translates them as homosexuals. The reference is given then to 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 10. It's possible, they say, that arsenokoites in certain contexts refers to the active male partner in homosexual intercourse, in contrast with malakos, the passive male partner. So their idea is that this word generally means homosexual, but if it's paired with a word like malakos, then it may be a passive-active homosexual meaning. BDAG, our essential lexicon for Koine Greek, says this about the word. Soft or malakos can be used of things or of persons. And obviously we're interested in the second meaning. And so there they suggest translations in italics of soft, effeminate, and then especially of catamites, it says, men and boys who allow themselves to be misused homosexually. And then it goes on to give some examples from primary sources, which you would be able to look up and check the meaning in a translation for these texts. A musician called Zenobius is said to be soft, and there the association is with someone who's a musician is soft, and so forth. Now, this doesn't really add anything to what we saw in Louw-Nida, but it does give you a way of looking at primary sources to check yourself. Now, in addition to what have been standard resources for doing primary source research around words, we now have electronic search programs. And so, for example, the three key ones on the market are BibleWorks, Accordance, and Logos Bible software. And in that, you can simply look up the meaning of a word. Here, for example, with BibleWorks, you put a period in your first search window. If you can see that on the left side, the left column it looks like. Here I have a period, malakah, and then an asterisk. That's my search window. And then up pop all the places where any form of this word will be found. And so we have something from 4th Maccabees, from Proverbs, from Matthew, from Luke, and 1 Corinthians. Now, this search will show anything in the Apocrypha as well as our Old and New Testament. And then as you click on these different words in that left column, then they pop up in translations that you've selected in the middle column. So I've selected the ESV, the NAS, the NIV, the NRSV, and then the Greek in my middle column. And you can see these passages in both translation and the Greek there. The third window for BibleWorks gives you some lexical information. And you need to know that you need to go beyond what you find in a program like this unless you've added the more advanced works like BDAG and Louw-Nida is available here, but it's not showing up in the third window. So this is how you go about doing research in certain texts. Obviously, we're not covering all the texts that are relevant here, but these are good resources for some initial research, and especially getting at how the word is used in Scripture. A step beyond those resources is the Thesaurus Linguae Graeci. This is available as a student at the Gordon Conwell Library, and it can be accessed online. You don't have to be in the library to access it. So you click on the library page and then access databases. And once you've checked in, then you can click on the Thesaurus Linguae Graeci, and then just choose whether you want to look at this in Unicode or Beta. I go with the Unicode input and display. Click Enter. And then what I'll show you here is, although you can do different kinds of searches here, I would click on a text search and a simple search here. So you click on that. Now there's some other things you can set here. One thing to do is in your settings, you can click a link to Perseus. And I'll be talking about Perseus, which is an online program. You can click on Perseus at this point. Perseus is going to help you find translations for these primary texts, because we simply don't have a good enough handle of Greek to just look at the Greek, and that's all we have to do. So we're going to be working both with the Greek and the translation sources. And then when you do your search, if you look at the top picture and click on that icon on the right, that will have a keyboard pop up, and then you just click on the different letters to get your word in that search for box on the bottom. So click on Molokos. Notice the sigma, it doesn't differentiate that should be a final sigma there, but it doesn't have it. But there's our word Molokos. And then you can click on a word index or a textual search to get your results. And here are the results. We can limit our search now to a certain form of the word, or we can look at all of the words. So we can look at all words, see the bottom box there, or we can search only the selected words that we've clicked on the boxes for. And then once we do that, our search results pop up. And so here we have primary sources where we find the word Molokos. It gives you a bit of the Greek text just to give you the context for your word. And depending on how much Greek you know, that might be all the research you need to do. But you could also click the Browse button and see if there's an English translation that shows up, say, for example, from Perseus, since you've already set that as one of your settings. If not, you could try to look at Perseus separately and then see what translations might be available there. Or there are other places on the web sometimes than Perseus that have translations. And so there are several different ways you can search for a translation of a primary source. Of course, not everything has been translated or is available electronically, and so that can be a challenge. If you are near a library that has a classics department, whether it's undergraduate or a university library or a theological library, you may have books in the stacks that you could check these primary sources for. So notice here that we have Thucydides' History, Book 2, Chapter 18, Section 3, Line 3. So you take down that reference and then go find some translation of it. And this does involve some tedious work, but to the extent it's available online, you can cut the time way down. Now here on Perseus, we see Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War with an English translation. So from Perseus, you could access that passage that we just saw in the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae. And here's what we actually get when we look at the Greek of Thucydides' history. We could get more of the text to read it in Greek context. Now, one thing to note is that sometimes a reference in a particular work like this is referenced differently in certain translations. So you can usually find the general section, but sometimes, for example, a translation might not give a particular line or a particular paragraph reference, but only generally a book and a section reference. So references can be a little off. And in that case, you might look for a unique word or a capitalized word for a name to locate yourself in the English translation. Here, Malakos is in italics and bold for presentation purposes, but just 4 words after that is Athenios, Athenians, and that's a capital alpha, and so you might look for Athenians in your translation in order to locate your passage. Also notice in the first line we have another name, Archidamos, and so you could look for those two as well. And then here we get a translation. Archidamus was severely blamed for the delay. He was also thought not to have been energetic enough in levying war. Now that whole phrase, not to be energetic enough, is the way this translator has rendered the word Malakos. He was too soft in levying war. What does that really mean? Let me translate it as not to have been energetic enough. And so here we have one example of this. It has nothing to do with homosexuality. But then would Paul really be saying in a sin list that those who are not energetic enough are not going to enter the kingdom of God? So obviously this is not the meaning Paul has, but it is one of the possible ideas or meanings that the word Malakos might have in its range of meanings. The internet resources for biblical and early church studies is available at the Cooley Center website, the Cooley Center for the Study of Early Christianity, which I direct, and Mark Poe has been the fellow for the Cooley Center. And we update this periodically. The 3rd edition of this is now online. And this is a collection of websites that you can go to for these studies, including getting at primary sources. So the idea here is to show you how much you can access online. Now, since things are always developing online, you also should be able to just do your own Google search on a specific text. You could type Thucydides histories in a Google search and see what comes up by way of translation. And so we could continue with our study of looking at other primary sources, and see here the word effeminate is used by Dionysius of Halicarnassus. The tyrant of Cumae at that time was Aristodemus, the son of Aristocrates, a man of no obscure birth, who was called by the citizens Malachus, here we word Malakos, the Greek word for soft, or effeminate, a nickname which in time came to be better known than his own name. Now, why was he called that? Remember, this is the passage that Boswell quotes. And the text actually says this: either because when a boy he was effeminate and allowed himself to be treated as a woman, in other words, sexually used, as some relate, or because he was of mild nature and slow to anger, as others state. The ambiguity of the word molokos, soft, could mean that he was sexually used and allowed himself to be sexually used, not just abused, but actually was participating in it, or that simply it has to do with his nature. Now, Boswell actually uses the second meaning that Dionysius gives, and he says, so therefore it can't mean anything to do with homosexuality. Boswell actually uses this text, a classic scholar, supposedly working with primary texts. He uses this text, but hides information. This is why you need to check primary sources. People might fail to catch something, or they might intentionally misinterpret a passage. Just because a scholar has referenced a primary source doesn't mean it's good scholarship, and you need to be able to check this. And although this might sound terribly scholarly for someone training for pastoral ministry, there is no question that denominations have been misled by people like Boswell, because those using his work have simply failed to check it. Another place where the word is used is in Plutarch's Eumenes, but the leaders themselves have been made unmanageable by their exercise of power and effeminate by their mode of life. And in the context, we see that effeminate reference has to do with living the soft life, such as feasting a lot, banquets. So here, we might ask whether effeminate really is the best translation, and should it not simply be living a soft life, the soft mode of life.